In Washington, D.C., power flows through information. But what happens when the most sensitive military intelligence in the world ends up on the wrong phone? In the halls of power, a national security advisor makes a fatal miscalculation. On the other side of the world, a special forces team walks into a perfectly orchestrated trap. When the dust settles, 4 American soldiers are dead, 3 more captured. And the most catastrophic intelligence breach in modern history is just beginning to unravel. Signal Lost, a 6-part podcast thriller about betrayal, courage, and the devastating consequences of a world where even our most guarded communications are never truly secure. When everyone is listening, nowhere is safe. Signal Lost. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Feeling overwhelmed by negative news? 5 Good News Stories is your daily dose of what's going right in the world. Like the 103-year-old granny who got caught speeding in her sports car because she was living life to the fullest, or the family who found their missing cat after 3 years when it showed up at their vacation rental. Remember Flop the penguin's incredible comeback after his injury? And that guy who broke the world record for most high fives in 24 hours while raising money for charity? These are the stories that remind us the world is still full of wonder and joy. 5 Good News Stories. Pure positivity 3 times a week. 5 Good News Stories, available wherever you get your podcasts. 5 Good News Stories.
Calaroga Shark Media.
What follows is not a definitive account of Vatican involvement in Cold War stay-behind networks, but rather a careful examination of available evidence and testimony. The complex relationships described are based on documented investigations, declassified records, and journalistic accounts, yet many aspects remain disputed. We present one possible interpretation of these events. While acknowledging that alternative explanations exist, this is not established fact, but an exploration of how elements within the Catholic Church became entangled in NATO's secret armies during the Cold War. This is White Smoke, Episode 14. Gladio's Shadow. Faith and fear. Throughout the Cold War, these two forces drove decisions that still reverberate today. As Soviet influence expanded across Eastern Europe in the late 1940s, Western powers developed contingency plans for potential Soviet invasion. One of the most secretive was Operation Gladio, a network of clandestine stay-behind armies designed to resist Soviet occupation through guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. By the 1950s, these networks had spread across Western Europe, with cells operating in Italy, Belgium, France, Greece, and beyond. Their existence remained largely unknown to the public and even to many elected officials. What makes Gladio particularly relevant to our exploration of Vatican history is how certain church properties and personnel became integrated into this shadow network, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unwittingly. At the center of this story stands the Vatican's uncompromising anti-communism, a stance that aligned the Holy See with Western intelligence agencies, despite fundamental differences in methods and objectives. This alignment was driven not primarily by political ideology, but by the Vatican's concern for religious freedom and the survival of the Church in the face of Soviet atheism. While the Vatican publicly promoted peace and reconciliation, some elements within the Church hierarchy viewed cooperation with Western intelligence as necessary insurance against what they perceived as an existential threat to religious practice. Today, we examine how segments of the Catholic Church became entangled in Operation Gladio. We explore the complex motivations behind this involvement, the facilities and networks that serve dual purposes, and how these connections eventually contributed to political violence far removed from the network's original purpose. This is the story of Gladio's shadow and how it fell across the world's oldest religious institution. To understand how elements within the Catholic Church became involved in NATO's stay-behind networks, we must first understand the profound fear of Soviet expansion that gripped Western Europe in the late 1940s and early 1950s. By 1948, communist parties backed by Moscow had taken control in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. The Soviet Union had demonstrated both the will and the ability to impose communist systems on neighboring countries. Western European nations, still recovering from the devastation of World War II, faced the very real possibility that Soviet tanks might someday roll across their borders. In response, NATO countries, led by the United States and Britain, began establishing clandestine resistance networks that would remain dormant during peacetime, but could be activated in the event of Soviet occupation. These networks, collectively known as stay-behind operations, with Gladio being the codename for the Italian branch, were modelled on resistance movements that had fought against Nazi occupation during World War II. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, had emerged from World War II with its own profound fear of communism. Pope Pius XII had witnessed the persecution of Catholics in the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Churches were closed, priests were imprisoned, and religious education was suppressed. In 1949, the Vatican issued a decree excommunicating Catholics who joined or supported communist parties. This decree formalized the Church's uncompromising stance against communism as an ideology fundamentally incompatible with Catholic faith. This shared anti-communism created a natural, if uncomfortable, alignment between Western intelligence agencies and certain elements within the Vatican. Both saw Soviet expansion as an existential threat, though they defined that threat in different terms: political and military for NATO, spiritual and institutional for the Church. It is crucial to understand that the Vatican's concerns were primarily about religious freedom and the persecution of Catholics, rather than about supporting Western military or geopolitical objectives. The Vatican's unique position in post-war Europe made it valuable to Western intelligence in several ways. Its diplomatic corps maintained contacts across the Iron Curtain that conventional diplomats could not match. Its global network of clergy and religious orders provided potential channels for information and influence. And its properties, churches, monasteries, seminaries and other facilities, were often in strategic locations and enjoyed certain protections under both international law and local custom. For some within the Church hierarchy, cooperation with Western intelligence represented a pragmatic response to the Soviet threat. If the Red Army ever occupied Western Europe, the Church would face severe persecution. Having emergency networks in place, communications systems, supply caches, trusted contacts, seemed like prudent preparation. This convergence of interests laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most controversial aspects of Cold War history: the use of Church facilities and personnel in NATO's clandestine stay-behind operations. It is important to emphasize that this cooperation was never formal Vatican policy. No evidence suggests that the Vatican hierarchy, under Popes Pius XII, John XXIII, or Paul VI, directly coordinated or organized Church participation in Gladio. Rather, it operated at the margins of Church authority, often through individual clergy members or local Church officials acting on their own initiative or responding to discreet requests from national intelligence services. The result was a shadow network that blurred the boundaries between spiritual and military domains, a network that would eventually extend far beyond its original purpose of preparing for potential Soviet invasion. The most concrete dimension of Church involvement in stay-behind operations was physical: the use of religious buildings and properties as hiding places for weapons, equipment, and supplies intended for use in resistance operations. Monasteries, convents, parish churches, and other ecclesiastical properties offered several advantages as storage sites. They were typically respected by local authorities and less likely to be searched than secular buildings. They often contained old structures with forgotten rooms, abandoned tunnels, or spacious basements ideal for concealment, and they were staffed by individuals who, due to their anti-communist convictions, might be willing to maintain discreet silence about what was hidden on their premises. According to parliamentary investigations conducted decades later, weapons caches were established in religious buildings across Italy, Belgium, and other Western European countries. These caches typically contained small arms, ammunition, explosives, communication equipment, and supplies that would be necessary for guerrilla warfare against occupying forces. Father Giovanni Conti, a parish priest in northern Italy, later testified to investigators that American intelligence officers approached him in the mid-1950s to ask if his church could serve as a storage site. A veteran of the anti-Nazi resistance during World War II, Father Conti agreed, believing he was helping prepare for legitimate resistance against potential Soviet occupation. A false wall was constructed in his church basement, concealing a cache that included automatic weapons, explosives, and radio equipment. The extent to which church officials knowingly allowed their properties to be used for such purposes varied widely. Many clergy likely believed they were aiding in legitimate resistance against a potential Soviet threat, rather than engaging in covert military operations. For them, this was not about espionage or violence, but about ensuring the survival of religious practice in the event of occupation. Similar arrangements existed in remote monasteries across the Alps, where geography would have made such locations ideal bases for guerrilla operations. The monastery of San Marco in the Italian Dolomites, for example, reportedly contained one of the largest Gladio supply caches, hidden in a network of caves beneath the monastery itself. Beyond physical infrastructure, certain clergy and lay Catholics became personally involved in stay-behind networks. Some served as couriers, moving messages or equipment between cells. Others helped identify potential recruits from among the faithful, particularly those with military backgrounds or technical skills valuable to resistance operations. In Belgium, Canon Louis Janssens, a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain, reportedly served as a liaison between the Belgian stay-behind network, known as SDRA-8, and certain church officials. His academic position provided cover for travel throughout Western Europe, during which he could meet with other network members without arousing suspicion. It's essential to emphasize that not all clergy were involved in Gladio, and those who were often did so in a context where they saw themselves as defending religious freedom rather than engaging in espionage or military action. Their involvement was likely more about practical survival than political allegiance.
Want this podcast without interruptions? Calaroga Plus delivers this show and over 20 premium shows completely ad-free, right to your favorite podcast player. We've just added exciting new series including Signal Lost. What happens when the most sensitive military intelligence in the world ends up on the wrong phone? White Smoke, taking you behind the scenes of all the interesting things that happen at the Vatican. And Pager Protocol, a thriller about getting exploding pagers into the hands of the bad guys. Plus, receive all your existing favorites like Palace Intrigue about the royal family, daily comedy news, 5 daily trivia questions, and 5 good news stories. Apple Podcast users, simply tap the banner in your Apple Podcasts app that says Uninterrupted Listening, Spotify and other players. Visit calaroga.com/plus. If you missed all that, check the links in the show notes. It's just $4.99 a month for no ads. Listen on any device, on any player you love, completely hassle-free.
In a world of smartphones and quantum computing, the fate of nations rests on technology from the past. Calaroga Shark Media presents a new podcast, Pager Protocol, a 10-part espionage thriller that will change the way audiences see the world. As an unusually large shipment of pagers makes its way to a volatile region, CIA analyst Sarah Miller grows suspicious. Meanwhile, in Zion City, Nexus Director Amos Ben David sets a daring plan in motion. Agent Eli Cohen is tasked with a mission that could determine the fate of his nation and reshape the entire region. Pager Protocol is available now wherever you get your podcasts.
The most sensitive aspect of church involvement came through intelligence gathering. The Vatican's diplomatic service maintained contacts throughout the Soviet bloc, gathering information about conditions behind the Iron Curtain that was valuable to Western intelligence agencies. While most of this information concerned religious matters, the treatment of Catholics, the status of church properties, the activities of underground believers, it sometimes included details of military or political significance. Monsignor Giovanni Benelli, who served in the Vatican Secretariat of State during the 1960s, developed a reputation for his extensive knowledge of conditions in Eastern Europe. His official responsibilities involved maintaining contact with church officials across the Soviet bloc, but his activities reportedly extended to gathering intelligence that was shared with Western agencies. However, the primary focus of this intelligence gathering was on religious conditions rather than military or strategic information. It's important to emphasize that most clergy involved in these activities believed they were serving legitimate purposes, preparing for resistance against potential Soviet aggression or helping protect religious freedom behind the Iron Curtain. Few, if any, would have considered themselves spies or military operatives. Rather, they saw their actions as extensions of their religious duties in exceptional circumstances. The exact extent of Vatican knowledge about these activities remains debated among historians. Pope Pius XII, whose anti-communism was well established, may have been aware of and tacitly approved some level of cooperation with Western intelligence. However, there is no evidence that subsequent popes, John XXIII, Paul VI, or John Paul I, were directly informed about the use of church facilities in stay-behind operations. What began as preparation for potential Soviet invasion gradually evolved into something more complex and potentially sinister. By the late 1960s, the original purpose of Gladio and related networks began to shift. With Soviet invasion seeming increasingly unlikely, some elements within these networks turned their attention to what they perceived as internal communist threats, specifically the growing strength of communist and socialist parties in Western European democracies. This shift had profound implications for the Church's inadvertent involvement in stay-behind operations. Resources originally positioned to resist foreign occupation were now potentially available for domestic political purposes, purposes far removed from the Church's spiritual mission and the original intentions of those clergy who had cooperated with the networks. The most troubling aspect of this evolution emerged in Italy, where the 1970s saw a period of political violence known as the Years of Lead. During this time, both right-wing and left-wing extremist groups carried out bombings, assassinations, and other attacks. Evidence that emerged decades later suggested connections between right-wing terrorists and elements within the Gladio network. The most notorious incident was the bombing at Piazza Fontana in Milan on December 12, 1969, which killed 17 people and wounded 88. Initially blamed on anarchists, subsequent investigations pointed to right-wing extremists with possible connections to Italian intelligence services and, by extension, to the Gladio network. While direct links remain controversial and not definitively proven, the potential exploitation of Gladio resources for domestic terrorism raises troubling questions. For the Church, this created a terrible irony. Facilities and networks established to protect against communism may have been exploited to support terrorism aimed at discrediting the Italian left, terrorism that claimed innocent lives in direct contradiction to Catholic moral teaching. Sister Elena Moretti, a nun at a convent near Bologna, later testified that in 1971 she discovered weapons hidden in an unused section of her convent's basement. When she reported this to her superior, she was told cryptically, "There are ways to serve God that are not in our prayers." Years later, after the Bologna railway station bombing of 1980 that killed 85 people, she came to suspect a connection between the weapons she had discovered and right-wing terrorism. The extent to which church officials were aware of these developments remains unclear. Most clergy who had allowed their facilities to be used for weapons storage likely believed they were supporting legitimate defense preparations, not domestic terrorism. However, as revelations about right-wing extremist connections to intelligence services emerged, some church officials reportedly began questioning their institution's involvement in stay-behind operations. Cardinal Achille Silvestrini, who served in the Vatican Secretariat of State, later acknowledged that by the mid-1970s, concerns had been raised about certain activities conducted in church properties without proper oversight. This suggests that at least some Vatican officials had become aware of potential problems, though their ability to address these issues was limited by the secretive nature of the operations. The full extent of connections between Gladio, right-wing terrorism, and church facilities remains contested by historians and investigators. What is clear is that the original purpose of stay-behind networks, preparation for Soviet invasion, had been corrupted, drawing elements within the church into associations far removed from their spiritual mission. The public revelation of Operation Gladio's existence came in 1990 when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti confirmed to the Italian Parliament that a secret stay-behind army had operated in Italy throughout the Cold War. Similar revelations followed across Western Europe, prompting parliamentary investigations in several countries. These investigations revealed the extensive network of Gladio operations, including weapons caches in civilian facilities, training programs for potential resistance fighters, and connections to various intelligence services. They also raised troubling questions about possible links between stay-behind networks and political violence, particularly in Italy. The investigations confirmed many aspects of church involvement, documenting the use of religious properties as storage sites and the participation of certain clergy in network activities. However, they also emphasized that this involvement was never systematic or officially sanctioned by the Vatican. Rather, it represented a patchwork of local arrangements, typically initiated by national intelligence services approaching sympathetic clergy. For the Church, these revelations prompted a quiet but significant re-evaluation of its relationship with intelligence services. Pope John Paul II, who had experienced both Nazi and Soviet occupation in his native Poland, understood the complexities of resistance operations. However, he also recognized the moral dangers of entanglement with operations that had strayed from their original purpose. While Pope John Paul II did not make public statements specifically addressing the Church's involvement in Gladio, the Vatican's internal review and increased transparency about such entanglements may have been part of a broader effort to reassess its Cold War-era actions, particularly after the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, reportedly led an internal review of church properties to ensure that any remaining Gladio materials were removed and that clear guidelines were established regarding cooperation with intelligence services. This review was never publicly acknowledged, but represented an important step in disentangling the Church from Cold War shadow networks. The Gladio revelations also prompted reflection among clergy who had been personally involved in stay-behind operations. Father Paolo Moretti, who had allowed his remote parish in northern Italy to be used as a communications centre for Gladio operatives, later expressed regret about his involvement. "We believed we were protecting the Church against Soviet persecution," he told investigators. "We never imagined our actions might contribute to violence against our own people." For historians studying this period, Church involvement in stay-behind operations represents a complex moral case study. The original motivation, protecting religious freedom against potential Soviet oppression, was consistent with Church teaching about resistance to unjust authority. However, the methods employed and the evolution of these operations created moral compromises difficult to reconcile with Catholic principles of peace and justice. On one hand, the Church's desire to protect religious freedom in the face of communist oppression was a legitimate concern. However, the use of violence, even in the form of resistance operations, complicates this moral stance, especially when it appears that the original aims of these networks were subverted for domestic political purposes. The legacy of Gladio's shadow across church properties remains a sensitive topic within Vatican circles. Unlike other controversial aspects of church history, this chapter has received relatively little official acknowledgement or discussion. This silence likely reflects both the classified nature of much information about stay-behind operations and the moral ambiguities involved in the Church's tangential connection to these networks. For scholars of Vatican history, the Gladio connection illustrates how Cold War politics drew even spiritual institutions into the shadow world of intelligence operations and potential violence. It demonstrates how fear, in this case, fear of Soviet communism, can lead well-intentioned individuals and institutions into compromising associations. The Gladio revelations of 1990 sent shockwaves through European politics. Parliamentary investigations in Italy, Belgium, Switzerland, and other countries revealed the extensive nature of stay-behind networks, raising profound questions about democratic oversight and accountability. For the individuals involved, the priests who allowed weapons to be stored in their churches, the nuns who maintained silence about unusual activities in their convents, the lay Catholics who participated in training exercises, the revelation of Gladio's existence and its potential connection to domestic terrorism prompted painful soul-searching. Many had believed they were participating in legitimate defense preparations, only to discover that the networks they supported may have been exploited for purposes contrary to their values. The most significant consequence for the Church came in its reassessment of its relationship with intelligence services. In the decades following the Gladio revelations, the Vatican established clearer boundaries regarding cooperation with state security agencies, emphasizing that such cooperation must always be consistent with Catholic moral teaching and the Church's spiritual mission. Pope Francis, in his efforts to reform Vatican governance, reportedly strengthened protocols regarding contacts with intelligence services, insisting on transparency and ethical oversight within the bounds of legitimate diplomatic confidentiality. This represents an important institutional learning from the Gladio experience. The story of Church involvement in Cold War stay-behind networks remains relevant today for several reasons. It illustrates how even religious institutions can become entangled in security operations during periods of geopolitical tension. It demonstrates how networks established for legitimate purposes can evolve in directions their original supporters never intended. And it raises important questions about the proper relationship between religious institutions and national security structures. Perhaps most importantly, this history reminds us of the moral complexity that exists in times of perceived existential threat. The Cold War presented the Catholic Church with genuine dilemmas: how to protect religious freedom against Soviet atheism while remaining faithful to Christian principles of peace. The choices made by various church officials in response to these dilemmas created consequences that extended far beyond their original intentions. Understanding this history requires acknowledging both the legitimate fears that motivated cooperation with stay-behind networks and the problematic consequences that resulted from this cooperation. It requires recognizing that well-intentioned individuals can make decisions that, in retrospect, appear deeply flawed. The shadow of Gladio across church properties has largely disappeared with time. The weapons caches have been removed, the communications equipment dismantled, the training operations discontinued. What remains is the historical question of how an institution dedicated to peace became connected, however tangentially, to networks that may have contributed to political violence. In this history, we find not a simple story of corruption or conspiracy, but a more nuanced tale of how fear, ideology, and pragmatism can lead even spiritual institutions into moral compromise. It is a history that continues to prompt reflection on the proper boundaries between religious mission and national security, between resistance to oppression and participation in violence. The story of Gladio's shadow reminds us that no institution, not even one guided by spiritual principles, is immune to the complex moral challenges presented by geopolitical conflict. In navigating such challenges, the line between prudent precaution and problematic entanglement can become dangerously thin. White Smoke is a production of Caleroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration.